You know, when we think about how a world religion gets its start, we usually have a pretty clear story in our heads. But today, we're going to put on our historical detective hats and dig into the origins of Islam. And trust me, what we're about to find might just change the way you see things. So let's start with a big what if. What if that earliest community wasn't actually a new exclusive religion at all? What if it was something much more fluid, more inclusive? Let's dive into the clues and see what picture really starts to emerge. Okay, every good investigation starts with a clue, and our first clue leads us to these figures called the Hanifs. Now, the traditional story paints them as these pure, native Arabian monotheists who rejected idols right before the Prophet Muhammad. You know, they perfectly set the stage for Islam. Sounds like a neat fit, right? Well, for historians, this isn't an answer. It's the beginning of a real problem. See, the traditional narrative really needs a bridge to get from Arabian paganism to the pure monotheism of Islam, and the Hanifs seem to be that perfect bridge. But here's the catch. When we look for hard physical evidence, inscriptions, archaeological stuff, there's just nothing. So we have to turn to the texts, and that's where this puzzle gets really interesting. The plot thickens quite a bit when you compare the sources. So on one hand, you have the Quran, which is our earliest text. And in it, the word Hanif isn't a social group. It's a theological concept, an ideal, this posture of pure Abraham-like faith. But then, fast forward a century or two, and you get these later biographies telling these very detailed stories about specific people like Zayed ibn or Warqa ibn Nawfal, and they're presented as these historical Hanif figures. And this leads us to the absolute crucial question for any historian looking at this stuff. Are these stories about Zayd and Warqa actual memories of real people? Or are they what scholars call retrospective constructions? I mean, to put it simply, did a later community basically invent these figures and project them back into the past to create a cleaner, more uniquely Arabian origin story for their faith? So, scholars have come up with a few ways to look at this. Model A, the idea of an organized Hanif movement, has really weak evidence going for it. Model B, the idea that there were just some scattered individuals seeking monotheism. Well, that's definitely plausible. It was a very religiously diverse time. But Model C, the theory that Hanif started as a Quranic ideal and was only later fleshed out into these biographical stories, that has the strongest support among scholars. So here's the bottom line. Our first big clue is basically a dead end. All right, since the Hanif clue didn't pan out, we need a new lead. So let's turn to our earliest documentary evidence and see if we can crack this code from a different angle. And this, my friends, is where the story takes a massive twist. So historians have this document that is, pretty much universally dated to the time of the Prophet himself. And it contains a single line that is so surprising, it has the power to change our entire investigation. It suggests that first community was defined by something completely different than a specific religious label. And here it is. This is from a document we call the Constitution of Medina. Just read it again. The Jews are one community with the believers. Whoa! This isn't some later story someone wrote down. This is a foundational political document, and it's revealing a community that was not exclusively Muslim in the way we think of that word today. The implication of this is just enormous. What this document suggests is that the very first community, the first Ummah, wasn't built on a new, separate religious identity. Instead, it looks like it was this ecumenical, multi-faith coalition of righteous monotheists, Jews and others, all united by a shared belief in one God and a deep commitment to piety. Now, to really get this, we've got to look at the exact words they were using in the earliest sources. And the key term here is mu'min, which means believer. It comes from a root word that means faith and trust. And what it describes is an internal state, a sincere, pious belief in one God. It's a really broad, ethical category, not a narrow, legalistic one. Okay, now compare that to the term Muslim, or submitter. This seems to describe something else, an outward, maybe legal or political status of submitting to God's authority. In fact, the Quran itself has this one passage where it tells a group of people to say, "We submit," but not "we believe," because faith hadn't actually entered their hearts yet. That's a huge clue. It suggests that in the beginning, being a believer was the real goal, and maybe being a Muslim was just one part of that much bigger movement. So, all of this leads us to the biggest question in our whole investigation. If this movement started out as this broad, ecumenical coalition of believers, what happened? how and why did it transform into the distinct, separate religion that we now call Islam? Well, the answer, according to a lot of historians, isn't found in theology. It's found in politics. You see, within just a few decades, this small movement of believers from Arabia suddenly found itself in control of a massive empire, stretching all the way from Spain to Persia. And suddenly, ruling millions of Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians, well, that creates a whole new set of problems that demand a much more defined, solid identity. A lot of scholars point to one ruler in particular, the Caliph Abd al-Malik, as the key player in this whole transformation. Around 691, he builds the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. And its inscriptions aren't just saying God is one, they're explicitly challenging core Christian beliefs about Jesus. Then, just a few years later, he issues brand new coins, stripping off the old Byzantine Christian symbols and putting explicitly Islamic phrases on them for the very first time. This, right here, was the pivot. This was the moment when that fluid believers movement was being forged into a distinct state religion, Islam. And the motive seems pretty clear. It was geopolitical. If you're going to rule a great empire, you need a great imperial identity, especially when your main rival is the powerful and deeply ideological Byzantine Christian empire next door. So let's step back and look at what our whole investigation has turned up. We started with what seemed like a pretty simple origin story, but the evidence has led us down a path to a much more complex and, frankly, more dynamic picture of how a world religion actually comes into being. When you get right down to it, the evidence strongly suggests that the earliest community wasn't some kind of exclusive, gated community with strict membership rules. It was more like a big tent revival for monotheists. The gates, the guards at the door, the specific membership IDs, a lot of that seems to have been added later, driven by the very practical needs of building and running a massive empire. Okay, so let's recap our findings. Our investigation points to a few key conclusions. First, the earliest community was probably a coalition of believers, where the focus was on piety, not labels. Second, that big pivot towards Islam as a distinct religion was really pushed forward by imperial politics under rulers like Abd al-Malik. And third, those earlier Hanif stories, they might have been created later on to give this new imperial religion its very own independent Arabian backstory. You know, what this whole process shows us is something universal. It's not unique to Islam at all. All religious communities, as they grow and change, they look back and they tell stories about where they came from. They construct a past that gives meaning and legitimacy to who they are in the present. It's a fundamental part of how human identity works, really. And that leaves us with a final thought to chew on. We so often think of religious and cultural identities as these ancient, solid, unchanging things. But this history shows us a time when those very identities were fluid, they were being debated, they were in motion. So what does it mean for us today to know that the very things that can sometimes divide us were once defined in a much more open and, you could say, inclusive way? That's definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining me on this investigation.